Somalia has a new president. Let's talk about the country that he's now president of. Somalia, you're our country in the spotlight. Lofi Poli Sci coming at you. Michael Pickering here talking about our famous question, what's going on in the world today? And today, we're taking an up-close and personal look at development in Somalia. That's right, it's another episode of Country in the Spotlight. Last week we did Panama, this week Somalia. Next week, who knows? Write in, tell us what countries you want us to take a closer look at. But on Monday, we talked about Somalia's new president taking office. Today, we're talking about the country that he'll be leading and the challenges he'll be facing. So let's dive into the data. We're going to look at GDP, GDP per capita, HDI, Gini, media freedoms by Reporters Without Borders, corruption by Transparency International, and civil liberties and civil rights by Freedom House. Let's go. So we're using World Bank data for GDP, GDP per capita, and Gini. And we have to start by saying there's a massive gap in data on GDP for Somalia from 1990 to 2013. For 23 years, the World Bank has no data on Somalia's GDP. That's a red flag right away, which we'll address later. But between 2013 to 2020, they've increased their GDP by about 50% to $6.9 billion in 2020. Which ranks them in the 180s-ish of all 200 countries in the world. And when we look at GDP per capita, it's the same gap in data for the same years, and the same trend in increases from 2013 to 2020. And in 2020, GDP per capita was $438, a person, a year. In 2020, there was only one country that ranked lower than Somalia in the world as far as GDP per capita. It was Burundi. Somalia is one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, looking at Somalia's Gini index measuring income inequality in the country, we only have one data point in 2017. And this lack of data, again, we'll come back to. But just going from that one data point 5 years ago, their Gini index was a 36.8, which is actually pretty good considering income inequality in the country and compared to other countries. For instance, the United States is a good bit higher than that. It has more income inequality. But that one data point, it puts Somalia at around the 80-ish mark in the world for income inequality, as far as about 200 countries go. So, top half of the countries, not bad. Though, taking that indicator and putting it next to GDP and GDP per capita, really what we can take this to mean is that poverty is extremely widespread throughout the population, and it's pretty evenly distributed as well. So a large portion of the population are impoverished, and they're pretty equally impoverished. Now, HDI, the United Nations Human Development Index, which puts together life expectancy, income, and average educational attainment. Again, a massive lack of data here for Somalia. The only official UN publication I could find of the score by the UN was a report from 2012. And in that report, it scored Somalia's HDI as a 0.285, ranking it 165 out of 170 countries surveyed that year. And although this is dated data, this, mixed with our previous indicators, points to the idea that not only is Somalia extremely poor, but educational and health levels are extremely low as well. Now, let's look at media freedom in the country by Reporters Without Borders. And in the 2022 report on 2021, Somalia ranked 140 out of 180 countries and territories, a really low media freedom ranking. Now let's look at corruption in the country as far as by Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index reported in 2021. And out of 180 countries, Somalia ranks 178, with only Syria and South Sudan being lower than it in corruption. And now to Freedom House, looking at civil liberties and civil rights in a country and gives it a score of 0 to 100 to see where the country is, 0 being not free, 100 being free. Somalia has a 7 out of 100, tying it for 7th place as the least free country in the world, alongside Saudi Arabia and Central African Republic. And that's the data we have on Somalia. And putting it all together, Somalia is one of the least free countries in the world. Its media freedom is amongst the lowest. Its corruption is amongst the highest. Its human development is amongst the lowest. Its income is amongst the lowest. And low income is widespread throughout the entire population. The president of the country, who was just elected, has a lot of challenges to face. But another challenge the president faces that our data don't explain, but is most certainly affected and reflected in the data. Well, let's talk about that freedom score for a second. A 7 out of 100, one of the lowest in the world, right alongside Saudi Arabia. Now, if you're not careful when you're looking at the data, you may think that Somalia, like Saudi Arabia, is one of the most authoritarian countries and governments in the world. And while that is true for Saudi Arabia, it's not true of Somalia. You see, you have to remember, Freedom House isn't measuring the level of authoritarianism within a government. It's measuring the amount of freedoms that the people of a country enjoy. And while Saudi Arabia, those lack of freedoms stem from an incredibly authoritarian government, that's not at all the reason for the lack of freedoms in Somalia. You see, Somalia is what we'd call a borderline failed state. Now, what's that mean, a failed state? It means the government has very little power outside of the capital or other major cities, and even within those areas, the power is constantly contested. Warlords and terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab have a lot of power in the country and control a lot of territory. And even the territory of Somaliland, within the country of Somalia, claims its own independence as a sovereign country, and Taiwan recognizes them as an official country. And the government of Somalia is powerless to do anything about this. All of our data today point to this fact, that the actual government in Somalia is extremely weak, and in some places in the country, it's non-existent. And that is a major challenge that the new president faces. It's not just about, can this new president take a developing country and help the people of the country in a real kind of way? But can he create a government that works efficiently enough to even try to do so? It's a big question. Now to the lack of data for so many of our indicators and years, because this is a major issue and it affects our ability to look at the trends of data in the country and the trajectory of development within Somalia. But this lack of data, this too is an issue of a failed state government. They don't have the money, the resources, or ability as far as reaching all the people safely in the country to collect the kind of data needed to actually produce all of our development indicators. And in many cases, not just Somalia, but developing countries all around the world, if the United Nations doesn't spearhead the effort and pay for the data collection, it doesn't get done. Simple as that. But it's not all doom and gloom in Somalia. Remember a couple months ago we talked about how horse racing was coming back to the capital? A sign that recreational sports feel safe enough to exist. And over the past decade, Somalia's income has increased by almost 50%. And a new president from a different political party as the previous president is taking office. This is the peaceful transition of power. This is a really good sign. And there's always hope, Lo-Fi listeners. And today, it's with Somalia. And it's a brief snapshot of what's going on in the world today. Check out lofipolisci.com, the music, the episodes, the blogs, the letters, the art. Add us on all the socials, people. Hit us up. And it's not a cliche or a catchphrase. It's a lifestyle. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Talk to you soon, Lo-Fi listeners. Pickering, signing off.